In December 2021, a passenger train disappeared from radar while crossing the northern passes. Only one survivor was eventually found. This is her account. I never meant to be on that train. It was supposed to be a simple detour, an overnight route through the northern passes, a quiet way to clear my head after everything that had happened in the city. I told myself a few days away would help, that some distance might make the decisions waiting for me back home seem less heavy. I remember how peaceful it looked when I boarded in the late afternoon. The platform dusted with fresh snow, the steel carriages gleaming under low gray light. A conductor in a navy uniform took my ticket without a word. The other passengers kept their eyes down, faces half hidden by scarves and heavy coats. It was the last day of November, but it already felt like the heart of winter. The train pulled away in a slow shudder. I found my compartment, second class, window seat, and settled into the scratchy upholstery. Outside, the town gave way to dark pines and rising slopes, each mile climbing deeper into the mountains. The snow thickened. The sky lowered itself until it seemed to press against the roofs of the cars. For the first hour, I watched the world slip by. The line was mostly empty, just the occasional cluster of lights marking some distant settlement. Sometimes I caught a glimpse of old signal towers, their rusted arms lost under drifting snow. A few times I thought I saw shapes moving along the tree line, but whenever I looked closer, they vanished. I told myself it was just fatigue. I hadn't been sleeping much. By nightfall, the snow turned heavy enough that the conductor announced over the crackling intercom we might be delayed. No one seemed surprised. I pulled my coat tighter and rested my forehead against the cold glass. Somewhere around midnight, I must have drifted off. The rhythm of the wheels on the tracks had a hypnotic pull, steady, measured, safe. I woke to silence. Not the quiet of a sleeping train, but a hollow absence of sound so complete it made my ears ring. I sat up, heart hammering, and looked around the compartment. The lights had gone out. Only the faint glow of emergency strips along the floor remained. My breath smoked in the air, cold enough to bite my skin. For a moment, no one moved. I could feel the stillness stretching all through the carriages. Then a single voice shouted, muffled and frantic. Another joined it. The walls groaned, a deep shudder that ran under my feet. I felt the carriage lurch sideways. A heavy thump echoed from somewhere ahead. The sensation was impossible to process. One instant we were moving, the next we were sliding, weightless. My body lifted an inch from the seat before slamming back down. Glass shattered. A blizzard of snow and ice tore through the compartment. My head struck the window frame with a dull, wet crack. Everything went black. When I came to, the world was quiet again. I didn't know how much time had passed. An hour? A day? My face was numb, my hair crusted with frost. I forced my eyes open. The compartment had tilted at an angle, the far side half buried in a drift of snow that pressed against the broken windows. Ice crystals glinted across the seats. The emergency lights pulsed in a slow rhythm, as if the train itself was breathing. I tried to stand, but the movement sent a bolt of nausea through my skull. I sank back down, pressing a hand to my temple. My glove came away streaked with dark, frozen blood. For a moment, I closed my eyes again, just breathing. When I opened them, I saw something that didn't fit. Along the far wall, in the snow that had blown across the aisle, a shape was etched. Two lines crossing over a circle. A symbol. It looked as though someone had drawn it with a fingertip. I stared at it, too cold and too tired to be afraid. Outside the broken window, the wind howled across an endless field of white. Somewhere beyond that, the mountains waited, indifferent and vast. I knew, in the hollow part of my chest, that help would not arrive quickly, and that the only way out of this place would be through it. The first thing I registered was the cold. It had sunk into my bones, a slow, relentless seep that left my hands useless and my thoughts heavy. I flexed my fingers inside the gloves, trying to remember how long I'd been unconscious. No answer came, just the awareness that if I didn't move soon, I might not move again. I braced both palms against the seat and pushed myself upright. The compartment tilted at a precarious angle, floor slanting toward the windows buried in snow. My boots slid an inch before catching on a ridge of ice. For a moment I just breathed, willing the nausea in my skull to recede. My ears rang with a high, constant whine that made it hard to judge any other sound. Slowly, I took stock. The other seats were empty. Blankets lay crumpled where passengers had been. An abandoned thermos rolled in the aisle, its metal surface rimmed with frost. No footprints marked the snow piled inside the windows. They were gone. I didn't understand it. The wreck couldn't have been more than a few hours ago, maybe less. But no voices called from the other carriages. No movement shifted the shadows beyond the broken door at the far end. A single thought moved through the fog in my head. They left me without me. I forced myself to stand, gripping the back of the seat for balance. Every joint protested. When I took a step, pain flared behind my right eye, bright and electric. I ignored it. Carefully, I climbed over the drift blocking the aisle. My boots crunched through the snow, each step leaving a hollow print. Paused by the broken window to peer outside. Night had lifted. A weak gray daylight revealed the train sprawled across the slope in a slow curve, several carriages half submerged. Snow fell in fine, constant sheets. Beyond the wreckage, the landscape stretched blank and featureless, broken only by low ridges and the faint line of the track vanishing into white. I turned back to the compartment, searching for anything useful. A few discarded bags. A coat draped over the back of a seat. No food. No water. The emergency supplies, if there were any, must have been taken.
I hesitated, then reached for the coat. The lining was stiff with cold, but better than nothing. I pulled it on over my own, feeling the extra layer trap a fragile pocket of warmth. When I stepped into the next carriage, I half expected to find someone waiting, a rescuer, another survivor. But it was the same. Silence. Windows broken. A thin drift across every surface. I kept moving. One car, another. Each the same. In the fourth carriage, the emergency kit compartment hung open, its contents stripped bare. At the fifth, the door wouldn't budge. Snow and ice had welded it to the frame. I pressed my gloved palm to the glass and peered through. The interior was dark, but in the gloom, I glimpsed something that made my breath catch. A line of footprints, bare feet, traced the aisle, each print clean and perfect. They began at the far door and ended halfway down the compartment, vanishing as though the person had simply lifted off the floor. My pulse thudded in my ears. I told myself it was a trick of light, or some draft exposing old markings beneath the snow, but I couldn't shake the certainty that they were fresh. I turned away, fighting the tightness in my chest. My breath fogged the air, the mist twisting into delicate spirals before vanishing. I needed to leave the train. If anyone was still alive, they'd be searching for shelter, not waiting in the wreckage. And if no one was left, if I truly was alone, then staying here would be the same as waiting to freeze. I moved back through the carriages, gathering anything useful. A torn blanket, a small metal lantern with half a canister of fuel, a pack of matches, a coil of rope. No food, but a single bottle of water that had frozen solid. I stuffed everything into a canvas satchel and slung it over my shoulder. At the rear door of the last carriage, the snow pressed almost to the roof. I dug with my gloved hands, carving a narrow passage wide enough to squeeze through. The cold bit deeper with every movement, until I couldn't feel my fingers at all. When I finally emerged, the wind cut across my face in a clean, merciless blade. I pulled my scarf higher, blinking against the glare. The wreck stretched behind me, half buried and silent. No movement disturbed the snow piling against the windows. I started down the slope, each step sinking to my knees. The satchel bumped against my hip, an anchor against the rising panic. I told myself I would find shelter, that the tracks would lead me somewhere, an outpost, a road, any sign of help. But as I looked back at the train one last time, a single thought rooted itself in my mind. I wasn't alone out here, even if no one else survived. The first hour away from the train was the hardest. The snowdrift climbed past my knees, every step a struggle that left me gasping for breath. My scarf froze stiff across my mouth. I had to stop every dozen paces to rub warmth into my hands before they turned numb again. Kept the tracks in sight, a faint dark line under the powder. They were the only reference in the blank expanse. Without them, I would have circled until exhaustion finished what the cold had started.
I tried not to think about the footprints in the carriage, or the symbol traced into the snow before the crash. But the images returned every time I blinked, lingering in the back of my eyes. At first, I scanned the horizon constantly, expecting to see someone waving, or perhaps a dark shape moving between the low ridges. But there was nothing. No sign the world beyond the train even existed. The sky stayed the same flat gray, the sun a pale smudge behind the clouds. I could feel the cold seeping deeper with every hour. My thighs began to cramp. My breath rasped in my chest. Somewhere around midday, I spotted a break in the landscape, a dark form rising behind a swell of snow. My heart stuttered. It might have been another carriage thrown farther down the line, or perhaps a signal tower. I angled toward it, moving faster than I should have. My boots slipped on a hidden patch of ice, and I went down hard, the satchel slamming into my ribs. For a moment I lay there, fighting for air. My vision pulsed at the edges, dark and unsteady. Get up. The words came in my own voice, but edged with something unfamiliar. Not panic, something colder, more final. I forced my hands under me and pushed upright. My gloves were soaked through now, the wet seeping into my sleeves. But when I looked up, I saw the shape clearly. It wasn't a carriage. It was a small building, stone walls rising just above the snow, the roof half collapsed. An old railway outpost, maybe. A maintenance shelter from when this line still carried more than freight and the occasional passenger. I nearly wept from relief. The last 50 yards felt endless. My legs threatened to fold with every step. When I reached the door, I tried the handle with clumsy fingers, frozen solid. I braced a shoulder against the wood and shoved. On the third try, it cracked open with a spray of brittle ice. Inside, the air was a few degrees warmer, enough that the ache in my bones eased by a fraction. A narrow room stretched ahead, lit only by the weak daylight filtering through a broken window. A desk stood against the far wall, papers scattered across its surface. An iron stove crouched in the corner, half buried in drifts that had crept in through a collapsed section of roof. I shut the door behind me and sagged against it. My breath clouded the air in ragged bursts. The outpost was empty, silent, but it felt inhabited.
as if someone had only just stepped away. I took a careful step forward, scanning the floor. No footprints, no fresh disturbance in the thin layer of frost. I swallowed, forcing my thoughts into order. First, warmth, then water, then plan. I crossed to the stove, kicking free the worst of the snow. My hands fumbled at the latch. When it creaked open, I nearly laughed. Inside lay a small stack of wood, brittle with age, but dry. Someone at some point had prepared it and never returned. I set the lantern down and struck a match. The flare of light seemed impossibly bright. My hands shook as I coaxed the flame to catch. When it finally did, the first trickle of warmth felt unreal against my skin. I sat back on my heels, watching the fire take hold. The ache behind my eyes eased fractionally. My thoughts steadied. I would survive the night here, no matter what. After a while, I explored the rest of the room. The desk held old manifests, water-stained and curling at the edges. Most were handwritten in a looping script I couldn't decipher. One sheet had been pinned to the wall above the desk, the ink faded to a pale ghost of lines and circles. A map, I thought at first, but when I leaned closer, I realized it wasn't any railway diagram. It was a series of symbols, spirals, crosses, circles joined by thin lines. Some matched the shape I'd seen in the train, the same shape traced in the snow. My scalp prickled. I backed away without touching it. As dusk pressed at the windows, the wind rose again, moaning across the broken roof in low, uneven gusts. I fed another piece of wood into the stove and pulled the salvaged blanket tight around my shoulders. The heat lulled me. My eyelids drooped. For a moment, I thought I heard footsteps crunching outside the door. A pause, then another step. I held my breath. Nothing. Only the stove ticking as the metal expanded. I released the air in my lungs, slow and shaky. Tomorrow, I would follow the tracks further down the pass. Maybe find a working radio tower. Maybe find help. But as darkness swallowed the last light, I knew the symbols wouldn't be any easier to leave behind. I don't remember falling asleep. One moment I was watching the stove glow dull red behind the grate. The next, the room was dark. The fire burned low to a single ember. My neck ached from the way I'd slumped against the wall. My hands were numb inside the gloves. I sat up too quickly. The room tilted around me in slow spirals before settling back into place. My breath clouded in the cold. The wind had died some time in the night. The silence pressed at my ears like cotton. I listened for any hint of movement, footsteps outside, voices in the dark. Nothing. I checked my watch, tapping the cracked glass. The second hand ticked, steady but slow. Sometime after 3 in the morning, still hours until daylight. A part of me wanted to wait, stay tucked in this narrow shelter until dawn returned. But another part, the part that had watched my reflection vanish in the train window, knew I wouldn't sleep again. Not with the symbols on the wall and the certainty that the world beyond the outpost hadn't forgotten me. I stirred the stove, coaxing the last scraps of heat from the embers. When I stood, my legs trembled, brittle as old wood. The desk waited in the corner, the papers scattered across it like offerings. I hadn't looked through them properly. I'd been too tired, too afraid. Now, with nothing else to distract me, I had no excuse. Crossed the floor and picked up the top sheet. The paper crackled under my fingers, the ink so faded I could barely read it. A date in the top corner, January 1972. Below it, a list of numbers and short notations in a language I couldn't place. Maybe Finnish? Maybe something older. I set it aside and tried the next, then the next. Each one was the same. Careful records of something I didn't understand. Columns of figures that felt less like supply manifests and more like observations. On the last page, a line had been underlined in shaking strokes. They come when the storm is loudest. I swallowed. My mouth was too dry. I turned back to the pinned sheet on the wall, the diagram. I forced myself to study it properly. The shapes were laid out in concentric circles, each ring made of symbols I'd seen before. Crosses over circles, spirals that bled into one another. In the very center, someone had drawn a small, precise triangle. Its point faced down, toward a handwritten word I couldn't decipher. The longer I looked, the more the symbol seemed to move, vibrating at the edges of my vision. My pulse thudded in my ears. I tore my gaze away, heart racing. I didn't know what the diagram meant, but I knew it wasn't a map. It felt like a set of instructions, or a warning. I moved to the window and wiped a patch of frost from the glass. The world beyond had become a negative. White snow under a moonless sky. The track, a thin black line vanishing into nothing. No footprints, no movement. I let the curtain fall back into place. If the storm hadn't stopped, I might have convinced myself to wait for rescue. But the wind had stilled. The silence had returned. And that felt more dangerous than any blizzard. I packed quickly. The satchel was lighter now, no food left, and only the stub of a candle I'd used to light the stove. My hands worked on their own, folding the blanket, stuffing it into the bag. Anything to keep from looking at the diagram again. As I bent to tie the satchel closed, something caught my eye. A thin, leather-bound ledger wedged under the desk. I hesitated, then pulled it free. The cover was unmarked. The pages inside crackled as I turned them. They were filled with the same looping script, only here and there broken by a line in English. They know when you see them. If you hear your own voice calling, do not answer. My mouth went dry. I closed the ledger and slipped it into my coat pocket before I could think better of it. When I stepped to the door, my hand hovered over the latch. I waited, straining to hear anything beyond the walls. No wind, no footsteps, just my own pulse loud in the hollow space of my skull. I drew a slow breath and pulled the door open. Cold rushed in, sharp enough to make my eyes water. I stepped into it, blinking against the sting. The snow glittered in the pale starlight, unbroken except for my own footprints. I forced myself not to look back as I started down the slope. The outpost felt too much like a trap, a place that had been waiting for me to stay. The tracks led onward, disappearing over a rise. With every step, the air grew colder. My breath came ragged, frosting my scarf to ice. I kept moving, because whatever waited here was patient, and I was running out of time to leave. I don't remember how long I walked. The world became a narrow tunnel, snow rising to my knees, breath rattling in my chest, the tracks slipping in and out of sight beneath drifts that seemed to reshape themselves when I wasn't looking. The cold was no longer an ache, but something deeper, hollowing me from the inside. I thought about the ledger in my pocket, about the line I couldn't forget. If you hear your own voice calling, do not answer. The first time I heard it, I almost believed it was the wind. My name, carried across the snow in a tone that matched my own voice exactly. Soft, measured, like someone repeating it just to see if I would look back. I didn't.
My pulse thundered in my ears. I kept my gaze fixed on the horizon, each step a deliberate act of refusal. The voice came again an hour later, closer. My name spoken as though in thought rather than sound, a breathless whisper in the hollow of my skull. I pressed a gloved hand to my mouth to stifle the sound I made. Not a sob, something smaller, more final. I knew if I looked back, something would be waiting. I trudged on. The slope climbed beneath my boots, rising in a gradual incline that burned my calves and numbed my feet. At the crest, I stopped, breath steaming in ragged clouds. Below me, the tracks curved around a long drift and vanished into darkness. No, not darkness, a tunnel. The mouth gaped in the mountainside, framed by crumbling stonework that might once have been decorative. Snow piled in uneven waves around the entrance, as if the wind itself had been reluctant to approach. For a moment, I stared, too tired to feel relief or dread. My thoughts moved in slow circles, searching for a reason to turn away. There wasn't one. I started down the slope, boots sliding in loose powder. Each step felt final, as though some line I hadn't known existed was crossing underfoot. The threshold, I paused. A low draft seeped from the tunnel's mouth, warmer than the air outside, though not by much. My breath drifted in thin spirals into the darkness. I lifted the lantern, the pale flame flickering against the stone. The interior swallowed the light almost immediately, but I could see enough. A narrow bore that stretched straight into the mountain, walls glistening with damp. I told myself it was shelter, a place to wait out whatever waited in the snow. I stepped inside. The cold retreated by a fraction. My heartbeat slowed. My breathing steadied, though every inhale tasted of old earth and rust. I held the lantern high, scanning the walls. Marks, dozens of them, scratched into the stone at shoulder height. Some were old, barely visible beneath centuries of mineral stain. Others were fresh enough that flakes of powder still clung to the edges. Circles over crosses, spirals, that same inverted triangle from the ledger's diagram. I swallowed. My throat felt too tight. I kept walking. The tunnel narrowed as I moved deeper. My shoulders brushed the walls. Each footstep echoed ahead and behind, a hollow double beat that made it impossible to tell if I was alone. Somewhere far ahead, a dim glow stained the darkness, not the color of firelight, paler, almost blue. I hesitated, but my legs carried me forward without asking permission. The glow brightened as the tunnel widened again. I emerged into a circular chamber carved directly into the rock. The floor sloped gently toward the center, where a shallow basin had been cut into the stone. A liquid pooled there, dark and glassy, reflecting the lantern's flame in perfect clarity. Above the basin, symbols radiated outward in concentric circles. The same pattern from the outpost wall. The same symbols I'd seen in my dreams. I stepped closer, heart hammering. The air here was warmer still, laced with that faint sweetness I'd first smelled in the train. My breath caught. I didn't want to approach. Every instinct screamed that I shouldn't. But my feet moved anyway, drawn by a pull I couldn't name. At the edge of the basin, I sank to my knees. The liquid wasn't water. It was thicker, almost like oil, though it didn't reflect the light properly. My face stared back, pale, hollow-eyed, lips blue from the cold. As I watched, my reflection blurred. The surface rippled, though no breath disturbed it. I thought I heard something beneath the surface, faint, muffled, a voice I almost recognized, my own. I clamped both hands over my ears and squeezed my eyes shut. The whisper came anyway, not sound, a memory that wasn't mine. They come when the storm is loudest. If you hear your own voice calling. I forced my eyes open. The reflection had returned, empty, ordinary. I didn't know how long I knelt there. When I finally stood, the lantern flame guttered low, the oil nearly gone. I turned and walked from the chamber without looking back. Whatever waited in that basin wasn't for me. I didn't need to know more. I only needed to survive long enough to leave. I don't remember leaving the tunnel. One moment I was standing in that hollow chamber, the last sputter of lantern light staining the walls with weak orange. The next, I was outside again, blinking into a world gone blindingly white. The wind had returned. It howled through the mouth of the tunnel, carrying thin sheets of snow that lashed my face raw. But it felt cleaner than the air inside, less heavy, less watched. I pulled the scarf higher over my mouth and turned away from the entrance. No footprints marked the slope behind me, though I knew I'd come that way. The thought made my skin prickle. I didn't waste time looking back. I started down the incline, every step an act of sheer will. My legs trembled with fatigue, each movement threatening to pitch me headfirst into the drifts. But the cold had become an ally of sorts, something sharp enough to keep me awake. The tracks reappeared beyond a low ridge, half buried under waves of snow. I followed them because there was nothing else to follow. Each rail was a thin, dark promise that somewhere, eventually, they would lead me out. Hours blurred into a gray haze. My thoughts drifted in slow circles, brushing the same fragments over and over. The ledger in my pocket, the voice in the tunnel, the way my reflection had vanished in that black basin. I told myself none of it mattered, that survival was the only truth that counted. A part of me knew it wasn't.
Near dusk, I topped a small rise and saw a shape moving across the snow ahead, a dark silhouette staggering along the tracks. My heart lurched so violently I nearly fell. I opened my mouth to shout, but the voice that emerged was a cracked whisper. The figure didn't turn. I tried again, louder. "Hey!" Nothing. I forced my legs to move faster, closing the distance with a slow, stumbling jog. The figure remained fixed on the tracks, never glancing back. As I drew close, my breath caught. It was me. Not a resemblance, not a trick of light. My own shape, wrapped in the same coat, the same satchel hanging from the same shoulder. I stopped. My chest heaved. Frost crusted my eyelashes. The figure paused, one foot lifted mid-step, as if considering whether to turn. Then it took another step forward and began to fade, piece by piece. The coat dissolved into a pale blur. The satchel vanished. Last of all, the shape of the head, dissolving into the air like breath and cold. I stood there until my knees gave way and I sank to the snow. When I finally forced myself up, the tracks were empty. Only my own footprints trailed behind me. I didn't call out again. I kept walking. Night descended in slow gradients, the sky darkening to a depthless black. I no longer felt my hands. My breath came ragged, a thin rasp in the darkness. I had no sense of how long I drifted along the rails. An hour, a lifetime. When the lights appeared ahead, two pale beams cutting through the snow,
I thought at first they were another illusion, another thing waiting to see if I would look. But as I drew closer, I heard the engine's low hum, a real sound, solid enough to make my throat tighten. A snowplow, its cab lit with yellow glow, the blade pushing drifts aside in slow, deliberate passes. Rescue. I nearly collapsed with relief. Figure climbed down from the cab, bundled in heavy gear. Their face was shadowed by a fur-lined hood. They raised a gloved hand in cautious greeting. "You all right?" the voice called. Human, ordinary, almost painfully real. I tried to answer, but no words came. My voice had emptied itself somewhere back on the tracks. Instead, I nodded once. The movement felt enormous. The person approached slowly, as if worried I might vanish if they moved too quickly. They took my arm, guiding me toward the machine. "You're lucky," they said, voice muffled by the scarf. "Storm's breaking. We almost missed you." I nearly laughed, but all that came was a ragged exhale that tasted of metal. They helped me into the cab. Warmth closed over me like a blanket. My eyes stung. For the first time, I let them. As the snowplow turned back down the tracks, I pressed my forehead to the glass and looked out. The darkness swallowed everything behind us. The tunnel, basin, the thing that had worn my shape. None of it followed. I closed my eyes. I knew I would never understand what I'd seen, that it would return in dreams. I wouldn't be able to escape. But in that moment, with heat seeping into my bones, I realized something simple. I was alive. And for now, that was enough.